I built the house with my own hands, but I no longer hold the keys. She says it softly, the old brass key making a dull click between her fingers. Her living room glows like a small island, a frayed quilt, the hum of a refrigerator. On the wall, a photo of the house in its first summer fresh paint, a rickety porch, a stubborn little flag, a flag kept not to prove anything, but to remind herself that belonging can be planted and grown. She remembers how it started. One shift cleaning offices before dawn, a second bussing tables after sunset, and the hours no one paid for measuring, saving, learning English in the margins of newspapers left on buses. She mixed concrete with hands scarred by winters. She stretched dollars until the edges frayed. She learned the grammar of permits and the calculus of survival, trading sleep for blueprints, trading fear for nails and paint. The first wall stood because she said so. A window framed a sky she promised to her children. Neighbors showed up with rice casseroles, hammers, and bad jokes, turning the skeleton of her dream into a neighborhood story. The house became a chorus, water running, children laughing, pots clattering, someone practicing scales off-key. It sounded like arriving. But the new world came with old shadows, paperwork, always paperwork. The notarized whispers of a system that calls you by a number before it calls you by your name. Still, she learned to smile at offices, to bring cookies to clerks, to keep every receipt and breathe through the fear. She paid what was due, and then some, believing dignity could weather every storm. She told herself the house would outlast confusion, prejudice, bad years, even grief. She did not foresee the coldest winter arriving as voices she loved. At a dining table that held birthdays and tamales, the conversation hardened. Sign here, they said. It's just for convenience. It's only a formality. You've worked so hard, Mama. Now let us handle things. The pen weighed more than the hammer she once swung. She looked at their faces, her blood, her hopes, and searched for the kids who once fought over the frosting bowl. She found adults with ambitions that would not look her in the eye. She delayed. She asked questions. She offered compromises. The voices sharpened, patience thinned, love turned conditional, like a bill marked overdue. One afternoon, in an office that smelled like new carpet and old arrogance, a man in a suit explained her life in small words. Everyone does it this way. Sign and protect your estate. Think of your legacy. He didn't look up when she asked what legacy means in a language that still bruises her mouth. The courtroom felt like snow, airless, fluorescent, predicting a storm. The judge's voice was calm, busy with other people's lives. Papers slid like blades. Her attorney spoke in paragraphs. The other side smiled a smile that asked forgiveness without admitting guilt. She tried to understand how a lifetime of labor could be itemized, how love could be notarized into something negotiable. She pressed the key inside her palm until it left a crescent moon of hurt outside. She stood beneath a sky so wide it made the building look small. She thought of the night she first slept on the floor of the unfinished living room. Sheetrock dust in her hair, a borrowed radio whispering songs into dawn. Back then, the house had no doors. Back then, she thought doors were for keeping out the cold. She never imagined they could be used to keep her out. She returns to the present and watches the steam fade from her cup. The room is smaller now, or maybe the memories have grown large enough to push against its walls. She speaks low so the truth doesn't wake the ghosts. I built the house with my own hands, but I no longer hold the keys. The syllables taste like iron. She rolls the key in her palm, and the metal remembers every lock it once kissed. In the window, the night holds its breath. Outside, quiet, neighbors will swear they heard a woman singing while she hammered. Children now, grown, learned to measure a life by weekends spent sanding, painting, scraping, starting over. Receipts in a shoebox could cover a table. Tomorrow there will be calls to make, papers to read, a path to trace back from silence to justice. But tonight, she sits inside the ache and lets it teach her. She tells the room what the judge could not hear. They mistook kindness for weakness. They mistook patience for surrender. They mistook belonging for permission. And when they took the keys, they took more than a home. They took my heart. She was 23 when she first saw the plot of land. To anyone else, it was just a forgotten corner, mudweeds, a few stubborn rocks that hadn't moved in decades. But to her, it was possibility. She stood there with a folded map and a heart that beat louder than the passing trucks. Her English was halting, her savings pitiful, her hands raw from cleaning other people's homes, but her vision was sharp. She wanted her children to grow up with walls that belonged to them, where no landlord could raise the rent or look at their last name like it was a warning label. Days were measured in shifts. 4 in the morning, she'd scrub floors in the downtown office towers, invisible beneath the fluorescent lights. At noon, she'd change into another uniform and bus tables at the diner near the train station. At night, she'd count tips at the kitchen table, sliding quarters into a tin box she kept hidden under a loose floorboard. Every dollar had a story. Every story pushed her closer to a house that wasn't borrowed. She learned to live in the margins. Thrift store coats, home-cut hair, Sunday meals stretched to cover 3 days. She skipped English classes when overtime called. She skipped sleep when opportunity knocked. The American dream wasn't handed to her. She chased it down alleyways, clutching bus transfers and faith like armor. She told herself, if I can build walls, I can build a future. On weekends, she walked the empty lot with her children. They didn't see what she saw. They only saw dirt. But she'd trace lines in the air here, the kitchen. Here the window where the sun will pour in. Here the tree where you'll hang your swing. She taught them to dream in blueprints. They'd giggle, throw pebbles, and run around the imaginary house as if it already stood. That laughter became the foundation before any cement was poured. That her dreams came at a price, while others spent evenings at dances. She was at the library with a Spanish-English dictionary, learning about zoning laws and permits. While friends bought cars, she bought lumber used, mismatched, but solid. She passed on vacations so the children could have new shoes for school. She turned down suitors who couldn't understand why a woman's first love could be a house. The house became more than shelter. It was proof that a woman who arrived with nothing but a suitcase and a stubborn heart could carve out a place in a country that didn't always open its arms. She imagined neighbors dropping by, teachers nodding respectfully at the address, children growing up with a permanent bedroom that didn't smell of strangers. It was dignity. It was stability. It was a flag she planted, not of conquest, but of belonging. She became known in the neighborhood as the woman who never gave up. People lent her tools, advice, sometimes just a smile. Even city inspectors, hardened by bureaucracy, softened when they saw her filing papers neatly, asking questions in careful English. "You're doing something good," one of them said once, almost surprised. She tucked that sentence into her memory like a precious receipt. Years passed. The tin box grew heavier. The walls rose higher. She laid the tiles herself, praying over each one like a rosary. She watched her children grow into the house birthday candles blown out in the kitchen, scraped knees on the porch, report cards proudly taped to the fridge. It was everything she had imagined and more. But while she was busy building the house, other things were building to ambitions she didn't see, resentments she didn't expect. In whispers between siblings, in casual jokes about inheritance, in the way some family members began to refer to the house not as hers but as ours, a quiet shift took root. She dismissed it as teasing. She wanted to believe love was stronger than paperwork. The truth was still far off, like thunder beyond the hills. But sometimes, late at night, she'd feel something unsettled in the air. She'd run her hand along the hallway walls, grounding herself in what she had built, whispering small prayers in 2 languages. She didn't know what was coming. She only knew that this house was her life's work and she'd given it to her family as freely as she gave them her youth. She believed the biggest challenges came from outside, language barriers, prejudice, paperwork, the grind of survival. But time would teach her otherwise. Because the cruelest storm isn't the one that comes from the sky. It's the one that comes from within your own family. It started slowly, the way a crack slips through a wall, not loud, not obvious, but steady. Her children had grown. The little feet that once ran through muddy foundations now wore polished shoes. They spoke English without accent, their laughter colored by sitcoms and schoolyard slang, their ambitions sharpened by the city. She loved it. She wanted them to rise higher than she ever could. She wore their success like a medal she'd earned with sweat. Her eldest, Alina, was the first to change. She had always been the leader of the siblings, the one who translated for her mother at doctors' offices, who argued with utility companies over late fees. Alina was sharp, assertive, proud of her American education. She became a real estate agent, a job that gave her access to worlds her mother had never stepped into. Gleaming kitchens, opened floor plans, conversations about market value over sparkling water. She began to speak in numbers. "Do you know what this house could fetch?" she'd say, walking through the kitchen, tapping the counters like a buyer. "You're sitting on equity, Mama." Mama, the way she said it changed to less tender, more transactional. Alina stopped hearing the echoes of sacrifice in these walls. She heard opportunity. That then came Luis. the middle child. Luis had a way of arriving when things were already done, claiming space like a guest who forgets he doesn't own the house. He had charm, yes, but also a restlessness. He bounced between job salesman, car dealer, contractor always, with big promises and bigger excuses. He'd lean against the doorway, smile wide, and say, "Mama, this house is our future. We're going to make something big out of it." But we often meant his visions came in quick bursts. Remodel this, rent that, refinance everything. He saw the house less as a home and more as collateral for his ambitions. Their youngest, Marisol, was different, quiet, observant, the one who held her mother's hand when papers came in the mail. But even she, after marrying a man with expensive tastes and louder opinions, began to echo the new chorus. This house, this asset, this opportunity. Her husband, Anthony, liked to remind everyone at family gatherings that in this market, sitting on property like this is like sitting on a gold mine. He'd say it while swirling wine, as if the home her mother built was a stock to be traded. Their arrogance didn't arrive in a single moment. It crept in with the comforts she had fought to give them. The home became a stage where they rehearsed their ambitions. She would catch them discussing plans without Helena explaining potential tax benefits. Luis pitching rental ideas, Anthony talking about legal loopholes. At first, she laughed it off. She thought, they're dreaming big. That's good. She believed family was unbreakable. She mistook their calculations for care. Meanwhile, she remained who she always was, humble, cautious, reverent. She polished the wood floors herself, humming old songs. She still kept her receipts neatly folded, just in case the IRS knocked. She hung rosaries by the door. She hosted Sunday dinners, laying out food like blessings. She wanted her children to feel this house was their safe harbor, not their battleground. The shift deepened the year Elena sold her first $1 million property. She began dressing sharper, speaking faster, glancing at her phone, even during grace. "Mama, we need to talk about estate planning," she announced one Sunday. "It's irresponsible not to." Luis nodded enthusiastically, eager for any plan that sounded official. Anthony chimed in with jargon he picked up from his lawyer friends. They talked over her, using words like liability, trust, title transfer, as if she were just a bystander to her own life's work. She listened quietly, nodding when they expected her to, her mind spinning in two languages at once. She wanted to protect them, but she also wanted to be heard. When she tried to explain her fear of signing papers she didn't fully understand, Elena sighed. "Mamá teases America. We have to do things properly. Trust us, we know what we're doing. Trust us." It sounded like a promise, but it felt like pressure. Little by little, they began to act like the house was already theirs. Luis parked his cars in the driveway like a dealership lot. Elena stored her clients' staging furniture in the garage without asking. Marisol's children treated the rooms like a weekend getaway spot. She didn't mind at first. She had raised them to share. She wanted to be generous. But the generosity began to look like erasure. Once, she overheard Elena talking to a friend on the phone. "Yeah, my mom's place. It'll be ours soon. We're just getting the legal stuff in order." She froze in the hallway, heart pounding. Ours soon. She hadn't planned on leaving yet. She wasn't ready to be written out of her own story. Then came the day Luis showed up with a contractor. He led the man through the living room like a tour guide, explaining potential renovations. "We can knock down this wall, open up the kitchen, add some modern lighting, flip it or Airbnb it. Either way, it's a gold mine." She stood at the doorway, stunned. He didn't even notice her at first. When he did, he laughed it off. "Mama, we're just brainstorming. Don't get sentimental. Don't get sentimental." This was the room where she held her children during storms, where she cried after her husband's funeral, where she prayed over unpaid bills and thanked God when the mortgage was finally cleared. Every inch of this house carried her fingerprints, her breath, her sacrifices. Sentimental was not a weakness, it was the truth. Anthony was the one who first suggested putting the house under joint ownership. "It would be simpler," he said. "Efficient, you'll still live here. Of course," he added smoothly, "but legally, it's better if it's shared." Alina backed him. Luis called it smart. They presented it like a gift, a safety net, but the net was already tightening around her. At night, she'd sit at the kitchen table with the key in her hand, listening to the house settle. It creaked in familiar rhythms, like an old friend clearing its throat. She wanted to believe her children loved her more than they loved the property. She wanted to believe their ambition was born of pride, not greed. But a quiet doubt had taken root. The arrogance showed itself in small moments, the way they corrected her English when she hesitated, the way they dismissed her concerns with polite smiles, the way they spoke about the future as if she were already gone. She tried to tell herself they didn't mean harm, but harm doesn't always arrive wearing a villain's mask. Sometimes it comes dressed as family, smiling, holding a pen. She looked at them all grown, confident, certain, and felt both pride and distance. They had inherited her drive but not her reverence. They loved the house as an asset. She loved it as a heartbeat. And somewhere between their ambition and her devotion, the fault line widened. I thought I was giving them a gift, but they only saw property, not sacrifice. Before there was a house, before the walls and the keys and the Sunday dinners, there was a girl standing barefoot on cracked earth, staring at a sky that did not promise mercy. The war had taken too many things: old neighbors, brothers, language, even the certainty of tomorrow. She learned early that silence could save you, that keeping your head down might mean surviving one more day. Her father was gone, her mother was tired, and she, barely 12, understood that childhood had been traded for endurance. The war carved lines into her memory that never faded. She remembered running through fields at night, clutching a loaf of bread like it was gold. She remembered the sound of boots in the distance, the way the ground shook before the soldiers came. She remembered holding her little sister's hands so tightly that their knuckles turned white, whispering prayers neither fully understood. She grew up in a world where fear was ordinary and hope was an act of defiance. By the time the fighting ended, the village was a husk. Schools were rubble, farms were burnt, and too many doors stayed closed forever. She helped her mother rebuild their shack with whatever wood they could scavenge. Every nail hammered was a declaration, we are still here. But staying meant starvation. Leaving meant danger. Still, she looked at the horizon and thought, somewhere beyond this, there must be a place where a girl can breathe without listening for gunfire. She left home at 17, alone. She boarded a crowded ship with a single suitcase, a headscarf, and a small photograph of her mother pressed between the pages of a prayer book. The voyage was long and merciless. Storms battered the vessel like a child testing a toy. The lower decks smelled of salt, sickness, and whispered dreams, but she held on, staring at the stars through a crack in the ceiling, telling herself they were guiding her. When she arrived in America, the air was loud. The language sounded like water rushing over stones, too fast to catch. The docks were crowded with faces, some hopeful, some broken, some both. She held her papers tightly, terrified someone might decide she didn't belong after all. They stamped her documents and waved her through. Just like that, her old life was gone, and a new one began with nothing but grit. Her first nights were in a cramped boarding house with 10 other immigrants. She slept on a cot that sagged in the middle, working odd jobs that paid pennies, factories during the day, diners at night, laundry rooms in between. She sent half of everything she earned back home, even when it meant she skipped meals. Hunger was familiar. Regret was not an option. She carried the war inside her like a compass. It always pointed her toward survival. When she married, it wasn't out of romance, but hope. He was kind, a fellow immigrant who understood the silence between their halting words. They shared stories in broken English, laughing through misunderstandings. Together they dreamed of a place that was theirs, not a rented room, not a temporary shelter, but a home. But the world tested them again. Just 3 years after their wedding, he died in an accident at the factory. A machine jammed. He stepped forward to help. The world stopped. She was pregnant with her third child, alone again, but this time in a country that barely knew her name. The grief nearly drowned her. There were nights she sat on the stoop of the boarding house, watching lights flicker across the city, wondering if it was possible to go on. But each time despair reached out, she pictured 3 small faces looking up at her, waiting. She had survived war. She had survived oceans. She would survive this too. She found work wherever she could, scrubbing, lifting, mending. She became a ghost in wealthy neighborhoods, cleaning houses she could never afford, overhearing conversations about vacations, jewelry, and inheritances. She'd pause sometimes at the threshold of a perfect kitchen, wondering if her children would ever know that kind of stability. But then she'd pick up her bucket and keep scrubbing. Dreaming didn't pay the bills. Determination did. She saved every penny. Pennies became dollars. Dollars became a down payment on a piece of land no one else wanted. It sat at the edge of the neighborhood, near the train tracks, a place where weeds grew tall and city inspectors rarely bothered to visit. But to her, it was holy ground. She stood there one Sunday afternoon, her children holding her skirt, and she said, This will be ours. The neighbors laughed kindly. Some shook their heads. Others offered advice. She took it all in stride. She didn't need their beliefs, she had her own. She taught herself how to mix cement from library books. She learned carpentry from old men who watched her determination with quiet respect. She hauled lumber with hands blistered and raw, sometimes with a baby strapped to her back. The nights were long, the winters brutal. There were moments she doubted, moments she cried in the dark so her children wouldn't see. But every morning she rose before dawn, whispered a prayer to the God who had carried her across oceans, and picked up her tools. Bit by bit, the house rose. A foundation, then walls, then a roof that kept out the rain. She planted flowers along the edge even before the windows were installed, telling her children, beauty must come first. The neighborhood began to take notice. They saw not just a woman, but a force. She inspired others to fix their porches, paint their fences, believe again. Her house was more than wood and nails, it was a story told in the language of resilience. Her children grew up watching this transformation. They saw their mother working double shifts, coming home with tired eyes but an unbroken spirit. They saw her negotiating with city officials in broken English but unwavering resolve. They saw her stretch every dollar like a miracle. She told them, "This house is our anchor. No one can take that away." They believed her, and she believed in them. She believed that love would be enough, that the sacrifices she made, the nights she spent alone hammering beams under a starlit sky, the meals skipped, the clothes mended beyond reason would weave an unbreakable bond. She imagined holidays spent together long after she was gone, laughter echoing through the halls, grandchildren running down the steps she built. She didn't see paperwork or ownership disputes. She saw legacy. She saw family. Through the years, she became the quiet matriarch of the block. People came to her for advice, for warmth, for proof that the American dream still meant something real. She shared her story not to boast, but to remind others that strength grows in silence, and love is built, not bought. But beneath the pride was exhaustion. Her body carried the toll of decades of labor. Her hands were gnarled, her knees ached. Her lungs sometimes wheezed from the chemicals she inhaled in those early cleaning jobs. Still, she pressed on. She didn't build that house for herself alone. She built it so her children would never feel rootless the way she once had. She believed love was the glue. She believed legacy would protect itself. She did not imagine that the very walls she raised could become battlegrounds. She did not imagine that the house she built out of hope could be treated like a prize to be divided. Looking back, she wonders if there were signs she missed. Perhaps the whispers about inheritance, the casual way her children began calling the house theirs, the dismissive jokes about her old ways, but she dismissed them all. She chose to believe in love over suspicion, family over fear. Her story was forged in fire, in oceans, in relentless labor. She had overcome war, loss, poverty. She had built a legacy from nothing. She had taught her children to stand tall on solid ground. She believed that was enough to protect them all. I believed love was enough to hold a family together. I was wrong. It began with papers. Not official ones at first. Printed templates, drafts from online estate planners, forms slid across the table between cups of coffee. Alina brought them one Sunday afternoon after lunch, still wearing her blazer from church. "Mama, we just want to make sure everything is organized," she said smoothly, as if she were doing her a favor. "You know how complicated things can get. We want to protect you." Protect. The word curled around her like smoke. She glanced at the neat stack of documents, columns, signatures, legal jargon, and felt a familiar panic rise. She'd faced immigration papers, work permits, mortgage applications. This was different. This wasn't about strangers or systems. This was her children sitting across from her, speaking like lawyers. "I don't understand all of this," she said in her careful English. "That's why we're here," Alina replied, smiling the way real estate agents smile when they're closing a deal. "You trust us, right?" Trust. Yes, she trusted them. She'd trusted them with her life, but something in Elena's tone made her chest tighten. She pushed the papers aside gently. "I need time," she murmured. Luis leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Mama, time is exactly what we don't have. If something happens to you tomorrow, do you know how complicated things will get for us? For the house, we're trying to avoid a mess." Marisol stayed quiet, eyes on her plate, but her husband Anthony chimed in from the corner, swirling his wine as usual. "This is the smart move. Everyone does it. It's about efficiency, not emotions." She wanted to believe them. She wanted to think this was love wrapped in legal language. But the house had always been more than property to her. It was the story of her life, pressed into wood and stone. Signing anything that changed that felt like erasing a part of herself. She stood slowly, collected the plates, and let the conversation die under the sound of running water. But it didn't end there. They started visiting more often, their presence warm on the surface, but edged with purpose. Alina would stop by with folders tucked under her arm. Luis would bring ideas for renovations that sounded more like investment pitches. Anthony lingered at the kitchen table, casually mentioning rising property taxes and legal liabilities. Each conversation carried the same refrain: you need to sign. At first, she deflected. Later, she'd say, I'm tired today. Or, we can talk another time. She hid behind the rhythm of daily chores, hoping the pressure would fade. But pressure doesn't fade when there's money involved. It multiplies. The house that once echoed with laughter began to hold arguments instead. Voices rose where songs once played. Alina accused her of being stubborn. Luis accused her of not trusting her own children. Anthony said she was being emotional about business. Marisol stayed mostly silent, eyes flickering between sides, torn but too timid to intervene. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, Alina slammed her hand on the table. Mama, do you even understand what will happen if you die without signing anything? Do you want the government to take everything? Is that what you want? Some stranger deciding what happens to this house? The word die landed like a slap. She had survived war, oceans, widowhood, but hearing her daughter speak about her death so casually made her feel suddenly invisible, like a problem to be managed. She wiped her hands on a towel and whispered, this house is my heart. I'm not ready to give it away. Alina sighed, exasperated. We're not taking it away. We're protecting it. But if you don't do this, you're putting us all at risk. Luis crossed his arms. You always talk about how you built this house for us. Now we're trying to keep it safe, and you're the one standing in the way. She stared at them, grown adults, successful, confident, and felt something crack inside. For decades, she had been the fortress. She had carried them, built their foundation. Now they stood united against her, speaking a language that twisted love into leverage. The whispers spread beyond the walls. She overheard Anthony at a family barbecue, bragging to a cousin about how they'd finally get everything sorted soon. Luis joked with friends about finally modernizing that old house. Alina mentioned future plans to a colleague at church. Each overheard word was a stone on her chest. Nights became longer. She'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, the house creaking softly around her like an old friend trying to comfort her. She'd replay their conversations, wondering if she had failed them somehow. Maybe she hadn't explained enough. Maybe she'd been too sentimental, too protective. But no matter how she tried to twist it, the truth stood unshakable. This wasn't about safety. This was about control. One night, she gathered her old documents, deeds, receipts, letters, and spread them across the table like relics. She traced her name on the original deed with trembling fingers. She remembered the day she signed it, the thrill of ownership, the quiet victory of a woman who had survived everything and carved her own place in the world. That signature wasn't ink, it was blood, sweat, prayer. Now they wanted to fold it into a trust, like it was just another line item. Weeks passed, pressure mounted, family dinners turned into interrogations. Calls came during her work breaks. Have you thought about it? Alina would ask. We really need to finalize this. Luis left voicemail after voicemail, growing impatient. Anthony started sending her articles about estate planning, as if drowning her in legal advice would wear her down. She grew quieter. The woman who had once built walls with her hands now built silence with her lips. She smiled politely, changed topics, avoided confrontation. But inside, she was unraveling. She had no lawyer. Her English still faltered with legal terms. The thought of fighting her own children terrified her more than any storm she'd ever faced. Then came the dinner. It was a Saturday evening. Everyone gathered around the table as if it were any other family night. Marisol's kids, laughing in the living room. Luis telling loud stories, Anthony refilling glasses. But the tension was thick, like a storm cloud pressing against the windows. After the dishes were cleared, Alina placed a thick envelope on the table. This is it, she said, her voice firm. The final draft. We've consulted with a lawyer. It's all ready. All you need to do is sign. She didn't touch the envelope. I told you, I'm not ready. Mama, Alina said, sharper now. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I built this house, she replied, her voice quiet but steady. Brick by brick. This house is my life. Luis slammed his fist on the table. And we're your children. Why is it so hard for you to trust us? Do you think we're trying to steal from you? Anthony leaned back, arms crossed, smirking faintly. It's not about stealing. It's about being practical. The room buzzed with their voices, overlapping, each one trying to corner her. Marisol finally spoke, timidly. Mama, maybe it's time. Maybe they're right. It would make things easier. She looked at her youngest, the one who used to sit beside her in silence, who used to understand without words. Hearing that broke something deep. She pushed her chair back slowly. Easier for who? She asked softly. No one answered. She stood, her hands trembling slightly. This house is not a burden. It's not a prize. It's not a business plan. This house is my soul, and I will not sign it away like a receipt. She walked out of the room, closing the door behind her. They called after her, voices laced with frustration, but she didn't turn back. Upstairs, she sat in the quiet of her bedroom, heart pounding. She could hear their murmurs downstairs, plotting, convincing each other she was being unreasonable. Over the following weeks, their strategy shifted. Less arguing, more guilt. Elena brought flowers, spoke softly, reminisced about childhood memories. Louise came by to fix the leaky faucet, talking casually about how things will be once everything's finalized. Anthony complimented her cooking. It was coordinated, a campaign. They circled her like polite wolves, smiles hiding their impatience. She tried to stay firm. She told them she needed legal advice. She told them she wanted time. But each request was met with gentle dismissal. You don't need that. We've already handled everything. You just have to sign. The nights became unbearable. She'd sit alone at the kitchen table, the brass key warm in her palm, whispering prayers into the dark. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like contested territory. Every creak sounded like footsteps coming to take something away. And then, one rainy afternoon, Elena arrived with the others. They were dressed well, purposeful, carrying briefcases and umbrellas. They gathered in the living room like a board meeting. Elena placed the documents on the coffee table, uncapped a pen, and held it out. Mama, she said, in a tone that left no room for argument, it's time. She looked at them, her children, her legacy, and saw not the toddlers who clung to her skirt, but adults with plans that didn't include her. She felt cornered. She thought of the endless nights building, saving, dreaming. She thought of her husband, her mother, the war, the ocean. She thought of everything she had endured to plant her roots in this place. Her hands shook as she reached for the pen, not out of agreement, but out of exhaustion. She was tired of fighting, tired of being made to feel unreasonable. She signed. The sound of the pen scratching the paper was louder than thunder. It was the sound of something shifting, irreversibly. They smiled, relieved, almost triumphant. Elena hugged her. Luis clapped her on the back. Anthony poured wine. Marisol whispered, "It's for the best." They celebrated like victors after a negotiation. She sat there quietly, the room blurring around her. Later that night, when everyone had left, she sat at the table with the key in front of her. It glinted under the kitchen light, innocent and unchanged, unaware of the betrayal it now represented. She ran her fingers over its ridges, tracing the memory of every door it had opened. When I placed the keys on the table that day, I didn't know it would be the last time I touched them as mine. They thought her silence meant surrender. They mistook her shaking hands for defeat. But silence, for her, had always been the space before the storm. The turning point came on an autumn afternoon, months after the signing. The air was crisp, the trees along the block dressed in orange and gold, and she stood in her living room, surrounded by faces that had once felt like home. Elena arrived first, carrying a clipboard like a commander, arriving at a conquered fortress. Luis followed, loud and confident, tossing his keys on the counter as if the house were already his. Anthony walked in last, leaning against the doorway with his usual smirk. Marisol lingered near the stairs, eyes downcast. They were there to finalize plans for remodeling, plans that involved knocking down walls, renting rooms, changing everything she had built. She sat at the head of the dining table, the same table where she'd once served them hot chocolate on winter mornings, and watched them talk over each other like investors at a board meeting. Luis spread out blueprints, pointing excitedly. This wall goes, open concept here, maybe a skylight, modernized the whole thing. We could make thousands on short-term rentals. Anthony nodded, and with the market the way it is, it's practically criminal not to optimize. Elena checked boxes on her clipboard. We just need you to sign this last set of permits so everything's smooth. You're still technically listed as a trustee, so stop. she said. The word cut through their chatter like a bell. They froze, surprised. She rarely interrupted them anymore. She stood slowly, hands on the table, her posture straight despite the ache in her joints. Her voice, soft at first, carried the weight of decades. "Do you remember," she began, "the first winter in this house?" Alina frowned. "Mama, what do you remember?" she repeated, louder this time. The authority in her voice startled even her. The children exchanged uneasy glances. Louise shrugged. "Kind of why?" She leaned forward, eyes locked on them. "There was no heat, no insulation. The walls were bare. I wrapped you in blankets and cooked on a little stove to keep the kitchen warm. I slept sitting up with you in my arms so your feet wouldn't freeze. Do you remember who put these walls up?" No one answered. "I carried the lumber myself," she continued, "piece by piece. I mixed the concrete with these hands until the skin bled. I worked nights so you could sleep under a roof that didn't leak. Every beam in this house has my sweat on it. Every tile, my fingerprints. I built this house when no one believed I could, when the bank laughed, when the neighbors shook their heads, when this country called me foreign. I answered by building something permanent." The room was silent now. Even Anthony's smirk faltered. She turned to Alina. "You were 8. Do you remember translating at the mortgage office? How scared I was, sitting across from men who didn't look at me like a person, only a problem to solve. I held your hand so tightly you told me afterward it hurt. Do you remember that?" Elena's eyes flickered. She nodded faintly. She turned to Louise. "You used to bring me nails from the toolbox, remember? You'd count them like treasure. You told the neighbors, 'My mama is building us a castle.'" Louise shifted uncomfortably, the swagger draining from his posture. She faced Mar. "You and I planted those roses together by the porch. Every spring, we dug into the earth with spoons because we couldn't afford proper tools. We laughed when they finally bloomed." Tears welled in Marisol's eyes. She looked away. "I did not build this house for strangers," she said, her voice rising. "I did not build it for investors. I built it for my children, so you would never feel rootless the way I did. I built it with love, not with profit in mind. And now you stand here talking about skylights and rental income, as if this house were just wood and numbers." Anthony cleared his throat. "With all due respect, it is just a house. Sentiment doesn't pay taxes." Her eyes snapped to him, sharp as a blade. "You may take the house," she said slowly, each word deliberate, "but you will never take my story." The room fell still. It was the kind of silence that makes even walls listen. She moved toward the window, gesturing to the neighborhood outside. "You think people wouldn't understand if this story were told today? If they heard about a woman who built her home with her bare hands, who survived war and widowhood, who raised 3 children alone and then had those same children pressure her to sign it away, they would rise up for me. There would be posts, hashtags, videos. Strangers would share my story because they know what it means to fight for something real." Louise scoffed, but it was weaker than before. "Social media doesn't change anything." She turned back to him, fire in her eyes. "It changes hearts. It reminds people what matters. And this house matters. I matter." Alina shifted uncomfortably, the confident realtor exterior starting to crack. "Mama, no one is saying you don't matter." "You are," she shot back. "Every time you talk over me, every time you treat my home like your business, every time you ask me to sign something I don't understand and call me stubborn when I refuse, you have forgotten who laid the first brick here." She placed her hand on the wall beside her, fingers spread wide, as if drawing strength from it. "This house remembers, and so do I." For a long moment, no one spoke. The grandchildren, who had been playing upstairs, peeked down the staircase, sensing the gravity of the moment. The adults stood in a semicircle around her, suddenly aware that they were not dealing with a frail old woman. They were standing before the architect of their lives, the keeper of their history. She stepped back toward the table. "I signed your papers because I was tired, not because I agreed, not because I gave up. But understand this. This house does not belong to your ambition. It belongs to my story. And whether you like it or not, that story will outlive every blueprint and every permit." Alina opened her mouth, then closed it again. Luis shifted his weight from foot to foot, avoiding her gaze. Marisol wiped her eyes. Anthony, for the first time, said nothing. She took the pen from Elena's clipboard, placed it deliberately in the center of the table, and pushed it away. "No more signatures," she said quietly. "No more plans without me." The house exhaled, as if relieved someone had finally spoken the truth out loud. They didn't apologize, not yet. Pride doesn't crumble in a single moment, but their confidence faltered, their unity wavered. They saw her not as an obstacle, but as the immovable foundation they had taken for granted. She stood taller than she had in years, the brass key hanging round her neck, catching the afternoon light. Her voice softened, but the steel remained beneath it. You can try to change the walls. You can paint over the history, but you cannot erase me. She turned toward the doorway, the air electric with everything left unsaid. And yet, she murmured, almost to herself, the fight didn't end when the keys left my hands. That was only the beginning. News doesn't always travel in headlines. Sometimes, it spreads through whispers carried on the wind between front porches, grocery store aisles, and late-night phone calls. That's how her story began to ripple through the neighborhood. It started with Mrs. O'Leary next door. She had been on her porch, trimming her geraniums, when she overheard the raised voices that dot the confrontation that cracked the family's polished surface. Later, she knocked gently on the grandmother's door and brought over a pie. The kind of gesture that carried more solidarity than words. I heard, she whispered, eyes wide, voice low. Good for you, honey. You stood your ground. From there, the story moved. The church ladies discussed it after Sunday service, shaking their heads but smiling with pride. She told them off. One said, imagine building a house with your bare hands and then being treated like a guest in it. Not her. She's got spine. At the corner store, the cashier, a young woman with dyed pink hair, recognized her and said, my grandma went through something like that. I wish she'd spoken up the way you did. The neighborhood divided in quiet ways. Some of the older families took her side immediately, remembering their own sacrifices, their own fights to hold on to what they built. Others whispered behind her back, pitying her for airing family business, as if standing up for yourself were something to be ashamed of. But she didn't flinch. She walked to the bus stop with her head high, brass key glinting in the sunlight like a medal pinned to her chest. Within the family, the aftershocks were louder. Elena grew distant, burying herself in work, avoiding phone calls. Luis tried to act like nothing had happened, bringing over tools or groceries. But his swagger was gone, replaced by a nervous energy. Marisol called often, crying quietly, apologizing without quite saying what for. Anthony, predictably, avoided her altogether. His arrogance had no script for losing control. Family gatherings changed. Where once the house was filled with overlapping voices and children's laughter, now conversations were careful, clipped, full of sideways glances. The dining table that had once held dreams now carried the weight of unspoken tension. Everyone knew something irreversible had been set in motion. No one dared say it out loud, but outside those walls, something unexpected began to happen. Her story, shared in fragments by neighbors, repeated with admiration in community spaces, began to take on a life of its own. If this had happened today, someone said at the community center, there'd be viral videos, people would be marching in front of City Hall for her. Another neighbor nodded. Hashtag her house, her story, they joked. But it stuck. Soon, the younger folks in the neighborhood started posting snippets online, old photos of her building the house, quotes from her defiant speech, little notes about her courage. Someone even interviewed her briefly at the library, her words soft but powerful. They can take papers, they can take walls, but they cannot take what I built with love. The clip spread farther than she ever imagined. Comments poured in. This reminds me of my grandmother. She signed away her farm because she didn't understand the documents. I wish she'd had her voice heard like this. She's a hero. Families can be cruel, but her strength gives me hope. Hashtag her house, her story. Elders deserve more respect than this. It wasn't fame, it wasn't spectacle, but it was validation, modern, loud, unexpected. Strangers who had never met her felt seen through her defiance. People from immigrant communities wrote letters, emails, messages through church networks, thanking her for standing up. Some told their own stories of betrayal cloaked as business. Others confessed they'd been too afraid to speak. Her voice had cracked something open. And it wasn't just strangers. Her courage began to ripple inside her own family. To Marisol's oldest daughter, a quiet teenager who spent most of her time scrolling on her phone, came to her one evening. Grandma, she said shyly, everyone at school saw the video. They're saying you're like a legend. She laughed, the sound soft and surprised. Legend wasn't a word she'd ever worn before, but in the girl's eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in months. Pride. Elena's facade began to falter as well. One Sunday after church, she stayed behind while the others left. People keep bringing it up, she admitted, not meeting her mother's gaze. They call me lucky. They say not everyone has a mother like you. Her voice cracked slightly on the word mother, and for the first time in a long time, silence between them wasn't a wall but a bridge waiting to be crossed. Even Luis changed. He started dropping by less with ideas and more with memories. He'd bring her a coffee and sit quietly, reminiscing about the early days, the mails, the mud, the laughter. He never apologized directly, but his tone softened. His sentences slowed. It was as if, for the first time, he truly saw her. The house itself seemed to respond. Where tension once clung to the air like dust, something else took root. Reverence. Visitors lowered their voices slightly when they entered, as if stepping into a living story. The roses she'd planted decades ago bloomed brighter that year, their scent carried through the open windows like a quiet affirmation. And yet, even as support grew and ripples spread far beyond her block, the nights remained heavy. It's easy to be strong when the sun is shining, when voices cheer you on, but strength is tested in silence. When the world goes still, when the walls remember every word, that's when the weight of betrayal settles deep. She would sit alone at the kitchen table after everyone left, hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold, staring at the key lying beside it. The community's admiration warmed her heart, yes, but it couldn't undo what had been signed. It couldn't erase the shift in her children's eyes when they saw the house as profit, not love. It couldn't give her back what was already in someone else's name. And in that silence, truth waited for her, not loud, not cruel, just inevitable. But in the silence of the night, I faced the hardest truth of all. Years passed, and the seasons rolled over the house like a familiar hymn. The walls bore new coats of paint, different furniture came and went, but the foundation, the one she had poured with her own hands, remained steady. She moved a little slower now. Her hands trembled more when she held her teacup, but her gaze carried something sharper than bitterness, clarity. She sat one evening at the kitchen table, the brass key lying in front of her. It was worn smooth from years of use, its once bright shine muted by time. She no longer carried it to open doors, but she kept it close, as if it held the pulse of everything she had built. Outside, laughter drifted from the porch, grandchildren playing, their voices spilling into the twilight like sunlight that refused to fade. She listened, eyes closed, letting the sound wrap around her like a soft quilt. A house, she murmured to herself, is made of wood and stone, but a home. Her voice caught for a moment. A home lives in memories, in values, in dignity. No one can sign that away. The betrayal still hurt. That would never fully disappear, but pain, when given enough time and reflection, has a way of becoming something else. Not forgiveness, not exactly, but understanding. She saw now what her children could not at the time. They were raised in a country that taught them to see property as power, ownership as success. She had raised them to climb, to dream, to aim higher. She never imagined that those lessons could curve back like a sharp blade. But she also saw that their actions, though selfish, did not define her story. Her story was older, deeper, rooted in the war-torn soil of her youth, carried across oceans, forged in the crucible of labor and love. Her story was built, beam by beam, nail by nail, in a language the law could not translate. She touched the key lightly. They may have taken the keys, she whispered, but not the love that built it. That love lived in every meal cooked in this kitchen, every prayer whispered on sleepless nights, every scraped knee bandaged on the porch, every Christmas morning where joy filled the rooms like warm light. It lived in the laughter of her grandchildren, who didn't yet understand deeds or trusts, but understood what it meant to belong. It lived in the neighbors' respect, in the community's admiration, in the countless lives touched by her defiance. She realized then that the house itself was not the legacy. She was her grit, her story, her dignity. Those were the real bricks that held everything together. She looked out the window at the roses blooming by the porch. She and Marisol had planted them decades ago with spoons because they couldn't afford shovels. Back then, they were fragile. Now they climbed the railing with stubborn grace, their roots deep, their petals opening toward the sun. The house might legally belong to someone else now, but those roses answered to no deed. In another time, she might have fought to reverse everything, hired lawyers, gone to court, battled until her last breath, but now, she understood something bigger. The American spirit she had embraced all her life wasn't about clinging to walls. It was about building again and again, no matter how many times life tried to take something away. It was about resilience, faith, and dignity that no document could erase. She stood slowly, walked to the front door, and stepped onto the porch. The evening breeze touched her cheeks like an old friend. She looked at the neighborhood the families walking their dogs, kids racing bikes down the street, couples holding hands under the fading light. She thought about all the other women like her who had built quietly, loved fiercely, and been underestimated until their voices shook the air. She placed her hand on the railing, feeling the strength beneath her palm. "I gave this house life," she said softly, "and it gave me mine." She turned to the children playing on the porch, smiling as one of them ran up and hugged her legs. In their faces, she didn't see betrayal. She saw the future one that would carry her story forward long after she was gone. She picked up the key from the table, slipped it into a small wooden box, and closed the lid gently. It wasn't a symbol of loss anymore. It was a reminder of everything she'd built, everything she'd overcome, and everything she still carried within her. This was her legacy, not the house, but the unshakable truth she had carved into the world, that dignity, once claimed, cannot be taken. The evening light settled softly across the living room, just as it had in the beginning. She sat in her favorite chair, the same worn armrest beneath her elbow, the same window catching the last rays of the sun. In her lap rested the old brass key. She held it gently between her fingers, tracing its familiar ridges, feeling the cool weight of a lifetime pressed into metal. "This," she whispered, "was never just a key." Her eyes glimmered not with regret, but with quiet strength. She remembered the first time she held it, sweaty from work, heart pounding with the thrill of belonging. She remembered unlocking the door after night shifts, the sound of her children running to greet her, the scent of food filling the house. That key had opened more than doors, it had opened a life. She looked up as if speaking to someone beyond the walls. A home isn't just something you hold in your hands. It's something you build with your heart. It's the memories you leave behind, the love you pour into every corner. That's the legacy. That's what endures. Outside, the porch light flicked on, casting a warm glow across the roses. Laughter echoed from the street. Life moved forward, as it always does, but her story stood anchored, unshakable, undeniable. She closed her hand around the key one last time, then placed it back into the wooden box with a soft click. Her voice, though gentle, carried the weight of generations. "If you believe dignity is stronger than greed," she said, "share this story." She leaned back, the setting sun framing her silhouette. The house stood around her, no longer just a possession, but a living testament to story built, protected, and passed on.